the progress that Matt Eberflus has made over the last 6 to 8 months, and Ryan Poles citing his resiliency and citing, the camaraderie of the team coming together and being intentional about having players to his house and not something that's just checking a box, and, really starting to build this thing up to what it's starting to look like. That being said, and we'll get into some of the pleasantries of Matt Eberflus, because I can start with those and give him a lot of credit for the adjustments he's made here this preseason. I had a lot of questions with how he would handle the preseason reps, how he would handle training camp, how he was going to handle the development of Caleb Williams. And I think right now, from my eye and my standpoint, all of those things look right. But at the end of the day, Matt Eberflus, whether it's fair or not, and Ryan Poles acknowledged that, hey, you were part of the rebuild and that was hard and you had to tough through that. He was a coach that lost 14 straight games. They started out the gates last year 0-4. They had a plan going into last year. Did they have enough to win every game last year? No. Their roster wasn't near as good as it looks right now on paper, but they could have won a few of those early season games, and they downright blew the fourth game against the Broncos. They should have, they very could have easily won week 2 against the Bucs. Losing week 1 against the Packers is always unacceptable. I don't care. Jordan Love hadn't come into his own at that point. So it wasn't like they were playing the Chiefs every week. And so that being said, you do finish the season 7-6. You start to make strides, but within that 7-6, you had moments of game management where things went wrong. And we talk about, what have we learned, from, you said, TJ Edwards said, you had to learn from losing those games late in the year and late in the game. Well, that's what I want to know, is what you learned from those things. And to me, one of the things that Poles did say is like, adjust and adapt when talking about Matt Eberflus. Well, I certainly hope so, because his game management at times wasn't great. On the defensive side, in situational play calls and clutch moments, it wasn't on point. And there was a few times where you could argue it cost them the game. And then he also admitted to being involved in the situational play calls on offense. And we all know the carnival circus that it was on third down for the Bears last year. They couldn't figure out what their bread and butter wanted to be. And so I still have questions for Matt Eberflus. He's checked a lot of boxes. I'm starting to come around to the idea of him, really improving as a head coach here this year. And I think he's looked good. But as you said, it all comes down to game day, Nick. And what are you going to do in those situational moments? What are you going to do in the game management? And Jason Leisure, to wrap this long thought up, said, he asked him about, did he do any self-evaluation in the offseason about his game management? And he said, not much. And then he said, he didn't really self-evaluate other than to say to get better, and that he's working with Shane Waldron on what they want to do to call plays in situational moments. Yeah, I wish I would have heard a little more transparency there. It honestly kind of sounded like a bit of an ego flex. Like, no, I didn't self-evaluate because I think what I'm doing is right. That's kind of how it sounded to me. And so I need a little more self-reflection and looking in the mirror. There was a few times last year he acknowledged that he didn't call the right plays at certain times. And that's okay to show a little bit of that humility. You're not giving up too much of the rope if you do that.
Yeah, no, those are really good points there, Braggs. And like when you come out of the gate in 2023 and get whooped by the Packers like you did, again, that falls ultimately on the head coach not having his team prepared for that game. And again, that 4-game stretch. Yes, maybe they still lose all those games, but you didn't have to lose it as bad as you did against the Kansas City Chiefs 41-10, right? So it's like there are things that he has to take fault for. And in terms of that question where he wasn't as open, look, ultimately, actions are going to speak louder than words. So even though he didn't say much right here, right now, you better go show it. And especially with this week 1 opponent again with the Tennessee Titans, which I'm as we kind of are getting closer and as the Bears are starting to now prep for that matchup, nobody should be really just marking the Bears down with a W for this game. And Eberflus is not going to do that, because if he does that, obviously you're not going to have your team set and prepared for what Tennessee can bring to Soldier Field. So I think for Matt Eberflus, the best thing for him, show it through your actions, and the best action you could show that you have learned from those mistakes, you can adjust, you can adapt, is ultimately you come out with a W in the win column each and every single week when obviously you're playing these games.
Well, and Eric Beauchamp says here in the chat, many of the flaws from game management will hopefully be fixed by the additions of Eric Washington and Shane Waldron. I think he was stretched thin as head coach and defensive coordinator, and I don't believe he believed in Getsy. And I think there's a lot of truth to that him and Getsy did not see eye to eye. And that's where I think that answer a little bit came from on his self-evaluation of game manager. He's like, well, not much, because now he believes in what they're doing with Shane Waldron and everybody's on the same page. I'll also enter into this discussion the fact that they had a small margin of error last year because their roster wasn't as good as it appears to be now. And when your roster is good, you can make a few mistakes and still win games. Those little decisions may not cost you as many wins or losses on the column. So, because your roster's a little better, there might be times where some of those little decisions won't have such a glaring spotlight on them, with the idea that this roster is so good that they can make up for it in other ways. So I don't expect them to be perfect. I don't expect them to pitch a perfect game, calling every game all year long. But at the same time, that's still a huge question that he has to prove. All the offseason stuff has been great. But as you said, Nick, what you do on game day is what's going to define you as a head coach here in Chicago.
We all silly like the mayor.